The footsteps came again in the dead of night, soft, deliberate, circling his cell like a predator stalking prey. Don Carlos, Prince of Asturias, and heir to the most powerful empire on earth, jerked awake on a thin mattress of damp, rotting straw. His breath was a ragged sore in the suffocating darkness, his heart hammering against his ribs as if trying to escape its bony cage. The sound was not a phantom of his tormented mind this time. It was real. It faded, leaving only the echo of his own terror and the relentless, biting cold that seeped from the stone walls, a cold that felt like his father's own breath. He was a son, imprisoned and condemned to die by the king who gave him life. This was not just a dungeon. It was a tomb for a living soul, and the man who had thrown him into it was the same man who had taught him to walk. His mind, feverish and starved, fled the oppressive blackness and returned to the sun-drenched halls of the Alcazar, to a time when his laughter, not his screams, had echoed off the walls. He had been young, golden, the sole heir to the global dominions of Spain. But even in those gilded days, shadows had clung to him, whispered about him. His tutors spoke in hushed, concerned tones of his temper, a tempest that could transform the charming, witty prince into a vortex of fury in the blink of an eye. One moment, he could disarm the sternest courtier with his sharp wit. The next, his fists would fly, his voice a roar that sent servants scattering like frightened birds. "The prince is not well," was the constant, murmured refrain, a poisonous chorus that he knew reached the ears of the one man whose opinion mattered above all others. King Philip II heard everything. Carlos could still see him, a figure of severe elegance and impenetrable reserve, his face as pale and impassive as carved marble. Those dark, discerning eyes missed nothing, least of all the flaws in his own son. The king had never embraced him, not with any genuine warmth. From his earliest childhood, Carlos had felt the yawning chasm of that distance, the unspoken question that hung between them at every public appearance and stilted private meal. Would this boy, this flawed and volatile creature, become his ruin? The first blow had fallen when Carlos was 12. A petty argument over a neglected Latin lesson had escalated, culminating in a snapped, venomous insult about the memory of his mother, Maria Manuela of Portugal. The king's hand moved with a speed and finality that stole the air from the room. The crack of his palm against Carlos's cheek was not just a sound, it was a foundational shock, a lesson in power and hierarchy. "You will learn respect," Philip had hissed, his voice low and colder than the dungeon's stone. Carlos had learned many things in that moment, but respect was not one of them. He learned fear, he learned hatred, and he learned that his father's love was a conditional, fragile thing. By 16, his rages were the stuff of courtly legend. He had thrown a servant down a flight of marble stairs for the crime of spilling wine on his doublet. He had shattered a priceless Venetian mirror because he believed his own reflection mocked him. The court held its collective breath whenever he passed, a wave of tension preceding him, a wake of relieved whispers following him. And always, his father watched. "He is unstable," Philip would confide to his closest advisors, men like the Duke of Alba, whose loyalty was to the crown, not the heir. A danger to himself, a danger to Spain. The words were not merely observations, they were a verdict in the making, a slow and deliberate laying of the groundwork for what was to come. Carlos knew they spoke of him. He felt his father's gaze during council meetings, a heavy, analytical weight resting between his shoulder blades, as if measuring him for a dagger or a shroud. The final, damning act of his freedom played out in the royal chapel. Drunk on stolen wine and boiling with a sense of injustice and suffocation, Carlos had stormed the sacred space, his shouts profaning the quiet air, his oaths against his father's rule, and the god who had cursed him with a crown turning the attending priests as white as their vestments. The king found him there, kneeling not in prayer but in rebellion before the altar, a sinner seemingly begging for forgiveness or a rebel plotting treason. Their eyes met in the flickering candlelight. No words were spoken, none were needed. In the profound silence, Carlos saw the shadows in his father's gaze deepen from disappointment into something absolute and terrifying. For the first time, he understood true fear. His father did not see a son, he saw a threat to be neutralized. The arrest came without warning. Don Carlos had been pacing his chambers, the weight of sleepless nights and paranoid thoughts pressing down on him. The air was thick with the smell of cooling candle wax and damp stone. Then came the sound, the grim, synchronized tramp of dozens of armored boots marching in grim unison down the corridor. He turned just as the door burst inward, splintering from its hinges. Royal guards, their breastplates gleaming like the carapaces of monstrous insects in the torchlight flooded the room. At their head stood the Duke of Alba, his face a mask of dutiful impassivity. "By order of His Majesty, King Philip II," the Duke intoned, his voice devoid of all inflection. "You are to be placed under arrest." Carlos laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that held no humor. "On what charge?" The single word struck him with the force of a physical blow. "Treason." He lunged then, not at the guards, but toward the desk where his ceremonial dagger lay. A futile, desperate gesture. Hard, unyielding hands seized him, wrenching his arms behind his back with brutal efficiency. He thrashed, snarling curses that named his father a tyrant and a usurper, but they forced him to his knees. "You can't do this," he spat, the words garbled by rage and humiliation. "I am your prince." The Duke of Alba's expression did not flicker. Not anymore. They dragged him through the palace, a spectacle of fallen grace. Courtiers pressed themselves against the tapestried walls, their eyes wide with a mixture of shock and worse, a palpable relief. The whispers slithered in his wake, fertilized by the seeds his father had sown. "They say he plotted with the Dutch rebels. I heard he tried to poison the king. Madness runs in his blood." They were lies, all of them, but they were the lies that would become his history. The last face he saw before the dungeon swallowed him whole was his father's. Philip stood at the top of the grand staircase, motionless as a statue, watching his son's descent into darkness. Their eyes met for one final, silent exchange. He saw no anger, no regret, only the cold, clean calculation of a king erasing a costly mistake. The cell door slammed shut. The iron key turned with a screech that sounded like the end of the world. And just like that, Don Carlos, Prince of Asturias, heir to the Spanish Empire, ceased to exist. The slam of the door was not an end, but a transformation. It was the sound of the world forgetting him. In the absolute blackness that followed, Don Carlos ceased to be a prince and became a creature of stone and shadow. Time, that once regimented measure of court life and royal duties, dissolved into a formless, suffocating paste. He no longer knew if it had been days, weeks, or months since his father's guards had thrown him into this tomb. The air was a physical presence, thick with the stench of mildew, his own unwashed body, and the deeper, more sinister odor of despair, a rancid perfume that clung to his skin and filled his lungs with every shallow, reluctant breath. His once fine clothes, velvets and silks embroidered with threads of gold, had rotted into damp rags, the proud insignia of his house now indistinguishable from the frayed threads. He spent an eternity, or perhaps only an hour, pressing a trembling hand against the wall, his fingers tracing the rough, uneven surface. He began to scratch, then to claw, his broken nails scraping feebly at the unyielding mortar. It was a futile attempt to mark the passage of time, to prove to himself that he still existed in a world that had continuity. But the walls gave nothing back. They were as silent and impassive as his father's heart. No sunlight, no moonlight, no glimpse of a cloud or a star ever reached him. The only light was a mockery, the flickering orange glow of a torch from the corridor outside, its light seeping beneath the iron-banded door in thin, wavering lines. He learned to hate that light. It was a teasing, torturous promise of a world beyond these four walls, a world of warmth and life and sky that he would never see again. It was the ghost of the crown he was promised. His body, denied sustenance and warmth, began its slow, systematic surrender. A fever took hold, ebbing and flowing in relentless waves, leaving him shivering violently one moment, his teeth chattering in the icy damp, and then drenched in a foul, cloying sweat the next. His joints ached with a deep arthritic throb, and his stomach was a hollow, twisted pit that gnawed at itself in a constant, agonizing hunger. The guards brought food only when they remembered, or when they were ordered to hard, weevil-infested bread, strips of rancid meat that turned his stomach, and water from a leather skin that tasted of rust and rot. He devoured it all, choking down the spoilage, his body's primal need for survival overpowering the prince's revulsion. Hunger, he discovered, was a more loyal companion than any courtier, a more relentless enemy than any rival. At night, or what his fractured circadian rhythm told him was night, the rats came. He heard them first, a skittering chorus of tiny claws on cold stone, their high-pitched squeaks sounding like laughter in the profound dark. At first, they were cautious, shadows moving at the edge of the torch glow under the door. But as his stillness became permanent, they grew bold. They would creep closer, their sleek grey bodies darting through the straw, their beady black eyes glinting with a terrifying intelligence. He had tried to kill one once, mustering a surge of desperate fury to lunge at the largest of them. But his body was too slow, his coordination gone. The rat evaded him with contemptuous ease, vanishing into the shadows and leaving him panting and humiliated on the floor. Now, he lay still, watching as they feasted on the crumbs he no longer had the strength to reach. A dark, detached thought surfaced in his mind. Perhaps they'll feast on me next. The thought should have filled him with terror. Instead, it provoked a low, hoarse laugh that echoed back at him from the stones, a mockery of his own demise. His mind, untethered from reality, began to unravel like a frayed rope. In the limbo between waking and sleeping, he dreamed of open skies and the thunder of galloping horses, of the weight of a crown that had never truly been his to hold. But these dreams were brittle, shattering upon the inevitable return to consciousness, where the walls were always there, seeming to press in closer each time, squeezing the air from his lungs and the hope from his soul. Phantoms bloomed in the shadows. His father's cold, judging stare would materialize in a damp patch on the wall. His mother's ghostly, sorrowful smile would flicker in a stray beam of torchlight. The blurred, beautiful features of a woman he might have loved, had his life been different, would whisper to him from the corner. Their voices overlapped, a cacophony of memory and madness, until he could no longer distinguish the past from the present, or truth from the terrifying fictions of his isolation. One day, or was it night? The silence became a roar in his ears. The pressure built until he could no longer contain it. With a guttural cry, he launched himself at the wall, clawing at the stone with a savage, desperate strength, screaming for release, for light, for death, for anything but this endless, consuming dark. His fingers tore, leaving smears of blood on the unfeeling rock. The guards outside, if they were there, made no sound. They ignored him. They always did. Finally, spent and broken, he slumped to the floor, his breath a ragged sob, his bloody forehead pressed against the freezing stone. Somewhere beyond these walls, Spain thrived under his father's iron rule. Councils met, wars were waged, the empire moved on. And here, in the cold, silent embrace of the cell, Don Carlos was already a forgotten footnote, a ghost in his own tomb. The guards confirmed his erasure in hushed tones when they thought him unconscious or asleep. "He screams like a demon," one muttered, his voice barely audible through the door. "Last night, it went on for hours. Begging for mercy, for death. I couldn't tell which." His companion, an older man with a voice like grinding stones, grunted and made the sign of the cross. "Cursed if you ask me. No man howls like that unless something's gnawing at his soul." The rumors they carried out of the dungeon took root and flourished in the palace above. In the kitchens, cooks exchanged fearful glances over their kneading troughs. "They say he tears at his own skin," one murmured, wiping flour-streaked hands on her apron. "Claims the very walls are breathing." In the stables, grooms shivered despite the season's warmth. "Heard he talks to ghosts," a stable boy confided to a skittish mare. "Names them, his mother, his tutors, even the king. Like they're standing right there in the dark with him." The courtiers, those who had once bowed so deeply, now spoke his name with a cocktail of pity and revulsion. "Madness runs in the blood." A duchess sniffed, fanning herself vigorously. His grandfather saw devils in his final days. A mercy the king locked him away before he could taint the throne. But in the quietest corners, where ambition was tempered by a sliver of conscience, a dangerous question sometimes surfaced. A young scribe, tasked with recording the prince's dwindling rations, once hesitated outside the cell. The screams had stopped, replaced by an eerie, rhythmic scraping. Against all orders, he pressed his ear to the cold oak. Not real, none of it. The prince's voice rasped from within, raw and broken. The crown was glass. The throne was ash. He knew. He always knew. The scribe recoiled, a chill seizing his spine. But as he hurried away, the thought took root. What if the prince wasn't raving? What if he was the only one who saw the truth? By dawn, even that whisper of dissent was buried, crushed beneath the absolute weight of the king's silence and the relentless, forgetting march of time. And in his cell, Don Carlos laughed, a low, broken sound at the joke only he could comprehend. The world called him mad, but he knew, with a terrifying clarity, that madness was the only sane response to a world like this. The physician arrived at dusk, a somber figure summoned by a rare and specific decree from the king himself. Dr. Mendoza was a gaunt, meticulous man with ink-stained fingers and a perpetually furrowed brow, a scholar who had treated nobles and peasants with the same clinical detachment. But he had never been called to examine a prisoner like this, a prince who had become a ghost, a son entombed by his own father. The journey through the winding subterranean corridors felt like a descent into another world. The guards' torchlight carving grotesque, dancing shadows from the weeping stone walls. "You are to examine him," the captain of the guard instructed, his voice a low monotone. "Not treat him. His Majesty's orders are explicit." Mendoza nodded, the distinction settling in his gut like a shard of ice. The cell door groaned open on rusted hinges, and the stench hit him first, a miasma of sweat, infection, and the sweet, cloying odor of rot. Then, his eyes adjusted to the gloom, and the sight made his professional composure waver. Don Carlos was curled in the far corner like a wounded animal, his once proud frame reduced to a skeletal husk wrapped in rotting cloth. Mats of filthy hair clung to his sunken cheeks, and his lips were cracked and bleeding. When his eyes flickered open at the sound of the intrusion, they were glossy with the sheen of high fever. "Another phantom," the prince rasped, his voice a ruin of what it must have once been. "Or have you come to bleed me dry, leech?" Mendoza knelt, setting his leather satchel down with deliberate care. He did not flinch when the prince recoiled, nor when a bony, trembling hand lashed out in a feeble gesture of defiance. "I am here to help, Your Highness," he said, the lie tasting like ash on his tongue. The examination was swift and brutal in its clinical precision. His hands, trained for diagnosis, moved with practiced efficiency, peeling back the prince's tattered shirt to reveal the festering wounds beneath. Oogle ulcers, born of filth and friction, circled his wrists where the iron manacles had bitten deep. Angry red streaks of infection spider-webbed up his pallid arms, a visible map of his body's losing battle. His ribs jutted out like the bars of a cage beneath his skin, and each breath was a shallow, rattling effort. "He needs treatment," Mendoza said sharply, turning to the stone-faced captain. "Clean bandages, a poultice for the fever, decent food, or he will not last the month." The captain's expression remained an unreadable mask. "Our orders stand. Examine, report, do nothing more." A hot flush of anger rose in Mendoza's chest. "This is not an examination," he retorted, his voice tight. "It is witnessing a murder." A dry, bubbling chuckle escaped Don Carlos's throat. "Tell my father," he wheezed, "that his physician has a poet's tongue. Will he hang you for it, I wonder?" The guards shifted uneasily, one muttering a prayer under his breath. Mendoza hesitated, his hand hovering over his satchel. Not for medicine that would be treason. Instead, he retrieved a small vial of lavender oil. He uncorked it, allowing the clean floral scent to cut through the cell's fetid air for just a moment, and dabbed a single drop onto the prince's pulse point. A meaningless gesture, a fleeting, useless kindness. Don Carlos inhaled sharply, his fever-bright eyes locking onto the physician's with a sudden, startling clarity. "She wore lavender," he whispered, the words fragile as glass. "My mother. Did you know that?" Mendoza could not answer. He could offer no comfort, no solidarity. The captain cleared his throat, a sound of finality. "Time's up." As the physician rose to leave, Don Carlos's hand shot out with a final, surprising strength, his skeletal fingers gripping Mendoza's wrist. "Tell me," he hissed, his gaze desperate and piercing. "Do I seem mad to you?" Mendoza met his gaze, and in that moment, the coiled, bitter truth fought its way to the surface. "No, Your Highness," he murmured, the words barely audible. "You seem like a man who remembers too much." The prince's grip slackened, and his laughter, a sound of pure, unadulterated irony, followed Mendoza out of the cell, echoing hauntingly down the corridor long after the door slammed shut, sealing the darkness once more. In the torchlit hallway, the captain eyed the physician with open suspicion. "You will report to His Majesty that the prince is unwell, as expected, nothing more." Mendoza nodded mechanically, already rehearsing the sterile, dishonest phrases he would use. But in the silence of his own heart, a more terrible diagnosis took root. Some sicknesses could not be cured, for they were not of the body, but of the crown itself. Back in the absolute blackness, a new and more primal torment took hold. Hunger was no longer a companion, it was a blade, carving him hollow from the inside out. Don Carlos lay curled on the stone, his stomach clenched in a knot of such agonizing tightness he could hardly draw breath. Had it been days since the guards had come, or had they simply stopped? Time had dissolved into a blur of thirst and delirium. He licked his cracked lips, tasting the coppery tang of blood where the skin had split. The last meal, a putrid slab of meat crawling with pale maggots, was a distant memory, its consumption a gagging, shameful act. Now, even that was gone, leaving only the gnawing, screaming void. A rustling sound made him lift his head, an effort that sent waves of dizziness through him. Rats. They emerged from the shadows. Tiny, skulking thieves, their whiskers twitching, their eyes glinting in the faint light under the door. He had grown accustomed to their presence, to their bold scavenging. But now, as he watched one scurry boldly across the floor, a new thought took root, monstrous and undeniable. Food. The first time the idea surfaced, his soul recoiled. He was a prince of the blood, heir to the Spanish throne. The act was unthinkable, a descent into subhuman depravity. But hunger had a way of stripping away 1,000 years of civilization, of reducing a man to his basest, most desperate instincts. His fingers twitched. The bold rat crept closer, sniffing at the frayed, filthy edge of his sleeve. Don Carlos held his breath, every muscle tensed. Then, with a speed that shocked him, he lunged. His hand closed around warm, squirming fur. The creature squealed, a high-pitched shriek of terror writhing violently in his grip, its sharp claws raking his skin. He gritted his teeth, tightened his hold with the last of his strength, and snapped its neck. The sound was small, final, and utterly damning. For a long moment he stared at the limp, warm body in his hand, his stomach churning with a profound, soul-deep revulsion. Then, the hunger roared back, louder than shame, louder than pride. He did not hesitate again. The first bite was the hardest. The flesh was tough, the taste metallic and gamey, but his body, screaming for sustenance, did not care. It was fuel. He obeyed its command, tearing into the rat like a starving animal, blood smearing his chin and fingers, the bones crunching faintly. By the third bite, he was weeping, hot, silent tears cutting tracks through the grime on his cheeks. The other rats, sensing the shift in the natural order, had fled into the shadows. All but one, a smaller creature, frozen in fear near the wall. Don Carlos wiped his mouth with a bloody hand and lunged again. This time, he did not kill it cleanly. The creature's piercing shrieks filled the cell as his teeth sank into its soft belly. Hot, coppery blood flooded his mouth, and he gagged, but forced himself to swallow. The rat thrashed in a final, agonized dance until, mercifully, it went still. He ate until there was nothing left but a few small bones. Then he collapsed onto his side, his body trembling uncontrollably, his mind utterly adrift. What have I become? The answer came not in his own voice, but in his father's, cold and mocking from the shadows. Exactly what I always knew you were. The fever had him now. A final, consuming fire that burned away the last remnants of the man he had been. Don Carlos lay on the cold stone, his body a map of ruin, his mind a ship adrift on a spectral sea. Each breath was a ragged, rattling struggle, each heartbeat a sluggish protest against the inevitable. The cell swam around him, the walls breathing in and out like the ribs of a great stony beast. He could no longer tell if his eyes were open or closed. The darkness had become a living thing, whispering secrets, curling around his limbs with the intimacy of a lover's final embrace. Mother. She stood in the corner of the cell, bathed in a light that had no source. Maria Manuela of Portugal, her face as soft and kind as the portraits he had cherished, the ghost of a smile gracing her lips. She held out a hand, her fingers pale as moonlight. You were always too much like me, she murmured, her voice the sound of distant chimes. Too much fire for this cold court. Carlos reached for her, a desperate, yearning gesture, but the chains held him fast, the iron biting into the festering wounds on his wrists, drawing fresh, warm blood. Take me with you, he begged, his voice a child's whimper. Her smile faltered, touched by an infinite sorrow. Not yet, my love. Then she was gone, and the cell was emptier than before. The fever painted new pictures across the void. A throne room, vast and echoing, stretched before him. The crown of Spain, a glittering circle of gold and gems, rested on a velvet cushion, calling to him. Then his father's voice boomed from the shadows, dispassionate and absolute. You were never worthy of it. Carlos laughed, or tried to. The sound emerged as a wet, gurgling wheeze, his lungs burning. I know, he whispered to the darkness. The crown shimmered, then melted before his eyes, dissolving into a pool of useless gold at his feet. Another face flickered into view, materializing from the mist of his delirium. Isabella, his betrothed, his almost bride, her dark eyes wide with a sorrow that was not her own. She had been a pawn, a girl promised to him in his father's grand political games. He had barely known her, yet here she was, kneeling beside him, her cool, ethereal fingers brushing the burning skin of his forehead. "You could have been happy," she said, her voice a gentle echo. "No," he rasped, the truth of it a solid weight in his chest. "Not in this world." She leaned closer, her breath a warm caress against his ear, a stark contrast to the dungeon's chill. "Then close your eyes, my prince. The next one will be kinder." A real sound cut through the visions, the groan of the cell door. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, approached. Carlos turned his head, a monumental effort, expecting the guards, the physician, or finally, death itself, come to claim its due. But it was his father who stood over him. King Philip II, resplendent in black velvet, his face a mask of regal impassivity. The torchlight from the hall gilded the sharp lines of his jaw and the silver threads in his beard. He looked every inch the king, a statue of power and control, a stark contrast to the broken thing on the floor. Carlos's breath hitched. "Come to watch me die." Philip did not answer. His gaze was a physical touch, sweeping over his son's ruined body, the hollowed cheeks, the protruding ribs, the infected, weeping wrists. Something flickered in the depths of his dark eyes. There and gone in an instant. Was it regret? Relief? The final satisfaction of a problem solved? "You should have been stronger," the king said at last, his voice devoid of any emotion warmer than the stone beneath them. Carlos coughed, a spray of blood flecking his lips. "And you," he gasped, putting the last of his strength into the words, "should have been a father." The accusation hung in the fetid air, sharp as a honed blade. Philip turned away, his black cloak swirling. "Wait." Carlos's voice was a raw, tearing sound. He had to know. "Tell me, was it ever real? Any of it?" The king paused at the door, a silhouette against the torchlight. For a single, heart-stopping moment, Carlos thought he might speak, might offer some fragment of truth, some absolution. Then, the door closed with a soft final thud, and the darkness, complete and absolute, swallowed everything. Alone again, truly alone now, Don Carlos let his head fall back against the stone. The cold was seeping deeper, slowing his pulse, calming his frantic thoughts. The chains no longer held any weight. His body felt distant, a burdensome shell he was ready to shed. The visions returned, not as torment, but as a welcoming committee. His mother's hand, Isabella's smile, the crown he never wore. He closed his eyes, and for the first time since the door had slammed shut all those months ago, he was not afraid. The servant girl, Anna, came as she had promised. She found him still, his breathing so shallow it was almost imperceptible. She knelt, ignoring the foulness of the floor, and pressed a damp cloth to his forehead, her hands trembling. "You shouldn't be here," he murmured, the words barely a breath. "Neither should you," she whispered back, her voice thick with tears. He wanted to smile. Instead, he coughed, the taste of copper flooding his mouth once more. Anna wiped the blood from his lips with the edge of her sleeve, a gesture of profound tenderness in this place of brutality. "Tell me," he rasped, his eyes closed. "Do they still speak of me up there?" She hesitated. The truth a dangerous thing? "Yes." "Lies, then." "Some," her voice wavered, breaking. "But not all. I remember." A single spark of warmth, the last he would ever feel, flickered in the frozen cavern of his chest. "What do you remember?" "The oranges," she said softly. "You stole a whole basket from the kitchens once. You stood in the courtyard and tossed them to the children. You laughed when the Duchess scolded you, said the price of a basket of oranges was cheap for such merriment." He had forgotten. The memory surfaced, bright and golden, a stolen coin from a buried treasure. They were sour, he recalled, the ghost of a smile touching his ruined lips. "The children made such faces. They loved you for it," Anna said, her tears falling freely now. The distant bell tolled again, marking an hour that meant nothing. Don Carlos's eyelids grew too heavy to lift. The dark pressed in, but it was no longer a prison. It was a release. Anna's hand found his, her small warm fingers closing over his icy, wasted ones. "Will you stay?" he asked, his voice the faintest exhalation. "Until the end," she promised. He closed his eyes. The last breath left his lungs not as a struggle but as a sigh, soft, unburdened and final. And in the profound silence that followed, Anna wept, her sobs the only eulogy for a prince who died in chains. Beyond the cell, Spain slept. The king in his palace did not stir. The empire turned, unseeing, uncaring, its history already being rewritten. The world moved on, as it always does. But in the dark, where no one would ever think to look, a single, fleeting memory of a prince tossing sour oranges to laughing children flickered for a moment. A small, defiant candle in the vast, uncaring night, and then was gone. Thank you for following this tragic story of Don Carlos. If this historical drama moved you, please like and subscribe for more deep dives into the forgotten lives that shaped our past.